Good afternoon, everybody. My name is 12 Gauge. Welcome to my channel. I'm still not going to be on camera because I'm not feeling 100%. I'm feeling probably about 70%. So I'm just gonna leave the cam off. But those of you that continue to show up and listen to my channel, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being an influence and the information that I put out and what I speak on. If you're new to the channel, please take a look in the library. I do have a lot of other cases and other information on um other topics such as addiction, self-help, and even the Idaho 4 case. I have a lot of videos on that. Um Today I want to continue the podcast that I started last night, and I want to talk about the pings, and I want to listen to the podcast, and I want to comment on it, and all this is under fair use. So um, please sit back and enjoy the ride. Let me figure out how to do this again. I hope everybody's doing well on this Saturday.
If they have a solid case.
I mean, people have been collecting DNA for a long time, so
Only get from the Washington Post.
Let me
You
start.
can listen to Post Reports wherever you get your podcasts. Go find it now and hit follow.
Heading out this weekend? Your next dinner could lead to more adventures. As an American Airlines Advantage member,
Pandora jewelry. Let love shine on your favorite bracelets, necklaces, earrings, and rings.
How the hell did his DNA end up on that sheath at that murder scene if it wasn't his sheath?
all we hear about are the pings. Brian Koberger, the alleged, was pinging everywhere.
It's a bad idea to have your cell phone with you when you commit a crime.
This isn't a whodunit, and I don't have to prove to you why he done it.
This is The Idaho Massacre, a production of KT Studios and iHeartRadio. Season 2, Episode 6, Pings and DNA Admissibility. I'm Courtney Armstrong, a producer at KT Studios with Stephanie Leidecker and Gabe Castillo. At the center of the prosecution's case against accused murderer Brian Koberger are records tied to his cell phone and DNA that allegedly places him at the scene of the crime. The defense has called foul on both areas of evidence.
Investigators now say they'd harvested DNA from an empty leather knife sheath. Police say that DNA matched DNA from Koberger's father, which they collected from trash outside the family's Pennsylvania home.
Does the government now have genealogy info that previously was controlled by individuals and private organizations? And how accurate is this database?
The genealogy sites that allows police to search public records of people who have opted in, saying, hey, if there's a murderer or rapist in my family, I don't mind if you use my DNA to try to find them.
Here's Stephanie.
We have to remember, DNA is a big ticket item for the prosecution. And just as a quick refresh, we know that, quote, a hit of Brian Koberger's DNA was found on a knife sheath left behind at the crime scene. And we also know that investigators connected that through familial DNA. Brian Koberger's parents' house was under surveillance in the days leading up to his arrest. His dad, we have to assume, tosses his trash in the garbage cans outside their home, and then investigators retrieve it. And from that trash, they're able to identify dad's DNA and put that into a database. And boom, there's a familial match. Now, look, this has been highly debated, as some say that the search and seizure of Koberger's family trash is questionable.
In the court,
What do y'all think as far as that's concerned? Do y'all feel that, obtaining that trash without it? Well, I know once it reaches the outside, it's public property, but, at a particular point, when they got that trash, they sent it back to Idaho to get the DNA off of it, okay? And last night I was listening to Howard Bloom, and I cut it short because it was going long. The end of that podcast that I was listening to last night stated by Howard Bloom that they had no magical way that they sent off for the DNA or anything like that, that he had done research and that they just sent it in just like they were normal people looking to get a DNA markup, makeup. So once it came back to the father. And, that's how they kind of got onto Brian is based on that. They did, as he said, I'm not saying this, I'm saying this is what the rest of the podcast said last night is the police sent off the DNA back from the trash, just like they would have sent off a DNA sample for themselves. There was no genealogy stuff done. There was none of that. And it came back to Brian's dad, and that's how they got onto Brian. So let's let you continue hearing this because my microphone just fell down. So if you're hearing some stuff in the background, don't freak out. It's just my mic being reset, okay? Thank you.
Course of researching this season, the team at KT Studios came across an article called How DNA and Cell Phone Evidence in Idaho Murders Complied with the Fourth Amendment. To get clarity on this pivotal information, I reached out to the article's author, Cully Stimson, who has singular expertise in both areas.
Hi, Courtney. It's Cully Stimson from the Heritage Foundation.
Cully, how are you?
I'm great.
Excellent. Your article it seemed just so on point with so many pertinent matters. I guess just to start, would you just let listeners know your name and your background?
Sure. My name is Cully Stimson. I'm a senior legal fellow and manager of the National Security Law Program at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to that, I served in the Navy JAG Corps, which is the lawyer corps of the Navy, and served as a prosecutor and defense lawyer. When I was a prosecutor in the Navy, I tried a bunch of violent crimes, including a case that involved DNA. It was one of the few cases that the Navy had used DNA in early on. This is a 92, 3, 4, 5 period of time. And I worked as a homicide prosecutor in Maryland. And I tried the first PCR case.
What's PCR?
So it's a type of testing of genetic material. So when you used to have blood testing, you're either A, B, or O, and those are broad categories of blood type. Then when we started using genetics, you had to have a large amount of genetic material, stuff left at a crime scene. But because the law is always behind technology, lags way behind it, the genetic labs were now using the next level, the next more sophisticated level, which required much less material, called PCR, polychromase reaction. By the way, when I was a Maryland homicide prosecutor, I was the head of attorney training in the office, which included training on how to use DNA in cases. And when I was an instructor at the Naval Justice School for 5 years, I taught the whole JAG Corps how to use forensic DNA. And of course, now we're so confident that we have 23andMe, or did, Ancestry.com and all the rest of it. And so tens of millions of people rely on that genetic material to find close and distant relatives all around the world.
You've been with DNA since the very, very beginning.
Well, I'm actually made of DNA like you. So, I think from the very beginning, but I've had the opportunity to work with it. And as a defense attorney, I fought against it, like any good defense attorney, and tried to poke holes, not in the scientific reliability, because I think that's a losing battle, but in whether it was collected correctly, whether testing procedures were done correctly, whether there is an adulterated sample. That's really where the game is as a defense counsel.
And this is going to be part of the case as well, is I believe that Ms. Taylor is going to look into the procedural parts of how the samples were collected. Were they correctly identified, bagged, Was there a chain of custody? Was all that stuff done correctly? Were the procedures followed to a T, or was it something that was mishandled? Was it contaminated? Was it held on longer than it should have? You know, we've heard numerous things about the DNA. And what's always been in my head about it is, sure, they got the trace DNA off the knife sheath, but we've never heard anything about the blood. Anything about the blood left behind, the blood that they found at his house on the pillow. You know, supposedly that was blood on the pillow that was a rust colored. So, you know, was there any match there? Did they find any DNA interjected into the blood in any shape, form, or fashion? That's probably under lock and key. That's probably under the gag order. But I've always thought deeper than the surface on this whole DNA thing, because sure, they got the one off the knife sheath. Whether it's enough to get a full makeup, I'm not an expert on DNA, so I'm not going to sit here and speculate on whether it was or whether it wasn't. But for some reason, they had enough to cross-examine the DNA that they found on the trash at his father's residence and ran his DNA and were able to collaborate it with Brian's. So I don't know how that was done, but if that's true, then the whole IgG thing, the whole mysterious FBI got involved with the IgG, and that's why they don't want to turn it over and this and that and the other, because what if it didn't happen? What if it didn't happen? Just food for thought.
I asked Cully how he thinks DNA and its collection will play out in this case during trial, as well as his general thoughts on the accused.
I mean, it's interesting. Look what he's studying. He's getting his PhD in criminal justice. I don't know what he's read, and I don't know what his course requirements are. If I was the prosecutor, I'd be pulling every book he ever had to read and every syllabus to find out and look for things about alibi and forensic evidence. And I would want to get into the guy's head by seeing what he has studied and what he's writing. But I don't think that, for example, the questions about the way the evidence was collected at his parents' house back in Pennsylvania is an issue at all. I mean, once you discard something, it's not yours anymore. You've abandoned it. And as a Fourth Amendment principle, you've abandoned any Fourth Amendment standing to complain that, you know, somebody picked up my cigarette butt that I tossed on the ground. Somebody rifled through the trash out in front of my house. Well, you gave it up. So you don't have a right to complain. And it's his parents' house. So he doesn't even live there anymore. He's an emancipated man. So he doesn't have standing to complain about his parents throwing stuff away in their house. So he has a double negative there. He had no standing if he threw it away himself, and he certainly doesn't have any standing if his parents threw it away.
Can I have you slow that down for 1 second? So what prompted you to write this article, you know, about how the evidence complies with the Fourth Amendment, and what is the Fourth Amendment?
The Fourth Amendment is part of the original Bill of Rights, which were passed, you know, a few years after the Constitution was signed and ratified by the states. And it essentially, insofar as this is related, says that the government may not engage in unreasonable searches and seizures of your persons, places, or things or papers. All right. And so for the government to get into your stuff, to see your stuff, typically they, at the very least, have to have probable cause to believe that you are the person that committed a crime, and that if they look into your stuff by getting a warrant that's very specific as to location of what they're looking for, signed by a judge, a neutral detached magistrate, the government can then look into gut into your house, look in the drawer, look in the closet for the knife, the gun, the rope, whatever you used for a crime. I was very interested in the development of Fourth Amendment law through the Supreme Court, because there was a case that the court had recently come down with called Carpenter against the United States, in a throwaway line that Justice Gorsuch said, where he, I think, made a mistake, suggesting that people would have a Fourth Amendment right to genetic material that is on third-party genetics hosting sites. If I spit into a vial and give it to Ancestry.com, and I have a contract with them to do so, I pay them a fee. They send me and only me my results back. If I then want to keep it private, that's it. No one gets to see what the results are. But if I want to take the extraordinary step of then providing that material, those test results, to a third-party genetics website, it's like putting it in the trash can. It's like hanging it outside my front porch for everyone to see, because you sign a contract that says this is out there for the world to see, because I want the world to see who I'm related to so they can see that they're related to me. And so when this case came along, I was reading the articles about it, and I thought, they're clearly clueless about this, because they were suggesting, oh, it's a violation of his Fourth Amendment right because they went through the trash. Oh, it's a violation of this. So I was like, whoa, slow down, everybody. And the Kohlberger case is poking along now, and it's getting closer to trial time, and more people are sort of interested in the mechanics of the trial. But I suspect the closer we get to trial, people will be more interested in the DNA and the difference between the SNP DNA genetics testing piece, which they did for the trash, and then the regular forensic testing for admissibility into court. And so, the closer we get to trial, the
Okay, so there he stated 2 different tests were done. One was for the trash, and the other one was for the forensic to be sent to the court. So does that mean that after they got the genetic mark or makeup of his dad's DNA, did they put that together with the DNA that they had off the knife sheath and sent that to the court to further the indictment or to be shown to the grand jury? Because all this stuff, it's just very mysterious to me. How all this, I wonder if Brian signed one of those forms, whether his DNA could be shared with other people, like, or he consented or did not consent to his DNA being shared to other entities, hence the police.
more that gets litigated, I'm sure people want to know in English what all that means.
Yeah, and is there a way to break those things down?
There's 2 types of forensic tests. What forensic means is used for criminal court. So just sort of file that away. Anytime you hear forensic and then a word after it, it means for criminal trial. So forensic DNA profiles, typically you find genetic material at a crime scene. You don't know who did it. You post it into the FBI's DNA database looking for a hit. And in the best case scenario, somebody's already provided their DNA because they're law enforcement or military or they're prior criminal and they've taken their DNA. You get a hit, and then you test, the chances of it being somebody else's DNA, and then you come up with a result. Here, when they found the sheath that held the knife that the subject used to slay the poor college kids, they tested the sheath and they found genetic material. That probably means epithelial cells that are found, believe it or not, in the sweat that comes off your fingertip. Okay. So everything you're touching, you're leaving a little part of your DNA on it. I mean, you can't even see it. Right. So whoever the dude or dudette is that killed these people left a sheath there. They test the sheath, and they were smart, because instead of just using one test and hoping that they'd get a random hit through the FBI DNA database called CODIS, CODIS, they also had a brain, because CODIS only tests, and I don't want to use scientific jargon, but let's just say 5 or 6 or 7, just a handful of what are called genetic markers. So you've seen the corkscrew DNA nucleotide, the thing that looks like a winding staircase.
Back in 7th grade.
Right. And so imagine that as that corkscrew is going down and down and down, there's stairs. It tests 6 or 7 or 8 stairs at different points in the DNA corkscrew. SNPs is different. SNPs it's an acronym. It stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. And so imagine what they're doing there is they're looking at 30 or 40 or 50 of those stairs. And that's just to see what variations there are in sequences on somebody else's double helix to see if there's a relationship between the person who left the DNA and somebody else. It's not used forensically in court. It's just, think of it as the Ancestry.com part of genetic testing. And so they tested, in my opinion, it hasn't been made public yet, they clearly tested the standard forensic testing, the standard DNA testing, probably PCR. And then they did SNP testing, most likely, because when they connected the dots between his cell phone and his parents' location, and he was registered at his parents' house, et cetera, and they went to the trash and got the parents' trash and tested some of the trash, Kohlberger had been visiting his mommy and daddy. And sure enough, on the trash, they find, through SNP technology, a person who was 99.9999%, think of it as chance of being his dad. So in other words, it's his dad. It's the dad of the person who left the genetic material on the
Wouldn't that have been something if he wasn't his dad? That would have been some interesting stuff to have to explain to the mother or all that, is you're not the dad. You told me all these years you were my dad, and now you're not the dad. That's crazy. No, but this is some interesting stuff that, it's not as cut and dry as many people feel that it is. The understanding behind all this, and once again, I'm not an expert, so I'm not claiming to be. I'm just trying to gain some understanding of what this guy is saying. And it seems to me like one test is ran with like not as many strands being tested, that is basically to get a marker. And the second test, the SNPs or whatever he said, is a lot more thorough, and it's able to identify more of the DNA to figure out the family tree, so to speak. Um, Also, I was wondering if they did if they found any DNA of the mother, the sisters, or anybody else in the family when they were doing all this DNA workup, because surely they lived in the house as well. So I was just wondering if they would have found any of that. Not that that matters or that it has anything to do with this case, but just like anything else, if you're going to go through a crime scene, you're going to find multiple DNAs. And I was thinking about this last night, and not to get too far off course, but I was thinking, early on in the case, the Kaylee's ex-boyfriend was being hit really hard with accusations of being the killer, right? And I was thinking to myself, I've heard Sergeant Friday discuss a case that he was involved in. And he said that he had burglarized the building that he was painting in. So they had his DNA at the location, but his DNA was there because he was working. And that got me to thinking, as far as like, surely Jack's DNA would have been all over that house. So if his DNA was found, then there would have been a reason why it would have been there, because he's the ex. He probably went into that home many times. And once again, I'm not saying that he was involved. My mind was just going a little bit on these avenues, on these rabbit holes, So let's get back to this.
chief. So if you remember I Love Lucy, when Ricky Ricardo said, Lucy, you got some splaining to do. Kohlberger doesn't have to do any splaining because he's the defendant. He has a right to remain silent. But it looks really bad for him, because how the hell did his DNA end up on that sheath in that bedroom at that murder scene if it wasn't his sheath? And if it was his sheath, why was it there? And he doesn't have to say anything. He can stand on his right to remain silent, and that remains his right throughout the trial.
Just going back to what you said, how you did training in the prosecutor's office and then also in JAG, was a lot of acceptance of DNA as something reliable? Was it just teaching the presentation and helping people understand it on a really basic level so it didn't seem like magic and so people could understand?
Well, it's a complicated question with a somewhat easy answer. You don't have to become a genetics expert as a prosecutor or defense counsel or judge to use DNA as a forensic matter in a criminal trial. But what you have to do to be good at either using it for or against your case is to understand collection protocols, testing procedures and protocols, areas where samples can get mixed up with other samples. And so just like with any other forensic techniques that are used, you have to get good at understanding the basics of the science and then get really good at understanding how you get from A to Z, getting into court, and then either defending its use or poking holes at its reliability. That's where the lion's share of the work is done these days.
Let's stop here for a break. We'll be back in a moment.
Finding the right news podcast can feel.
This is Ben Higgins from the Ben and Ashley I are wrapped in luxury with the
reasons for wanting to be healthy. Family, no matter what your why is.
Been so much back and forth over the phone pings because, again, this is going to be a big ticket item. It sounds like for sure the accused Bryan Kohberger was out and about a whole lot that fateful morning, both before and after the murders. Investigators claim that they have phone pings that place Kohberger near the house the morning of the murders. And Kohberger's defense team is arguing that he was nowhere near the house when the murders happened. What is so interesting here is that the same data that the prosecution is going to use to place Kohberger at the scene is the exact same data that the defense is going to use to dispute that.
I reached out to Scott Green, founder of Great Scott Enterprises. For nearly 40 years, he's been collecting, analyzing, and helping to explain complex electronic evidence.
I collect the data, I analyze the data, I make sense of the data, and then I present the data in court, either to a jury or to the judge.
What we wanted to speak with you about is the cell phone data. And all we hear about are the pings. Bryan Kohberger, the alleged, was pinging everywhere. Can you please explain what are cell phone pings or signals and how specific are they?
So a ping, in the way it's been used in the media, and I read the articles with regards to cell phones and towers, is a connection between a cell phone and a tower. Those connections fall into three different categories generally. They are a phone call that would ping off a tower or connect to a tower, and they're referred to as pings. So they occur when somebody makes a phone call, they occur when somebody uses data, and they occur when somebody sends a standard SMS or text message. As far as how specific a ping is, the tower knows the direction that the cell phone is from the tower. So what you get out of the ping and out of the cell phone carrier is a direction from the tower, generally in a pie-shaped area that shows the direction from the tower that the cell phone is. And when you have them moving through space and time, you can get an idea as to where the cell phone is going and how fast it's moving and some things like that. You get some estimates out of that. But you don't get an exact position out of the cell phone carrier information.
What I understood as you described it was that the pings happen when something active is occurring, a call, a text, or using data. These pings also happen passively. I have my phone here right now. Is this pinging?
Cell phones and towers are communicating most of the time, usually because there's data transactions between a cell phone and a tower. That could be updates.
This is the question I have on this. And once again, I'm not an expert. Don't claim to be. Don't come at me. Like, you know how your cell phone, like right now, my cell phone's right here next to me. And it's constantly like I have Snapchat in the background updating my location every couple of minutes because I see the little Snapchat icon pop up like it just did. And then it goes away. So that would tell me that collaborated with something to give that location because it sent a signal to my cell phone for that little icon to pop up and then when it goes away, then it's registered, okay, this is where I am. But I could be wrong. I don't have my phone on. I'm not sending text messages. I'm not making phone calls right now, but I do have location on my phone. So if my location was off, obviously that wouldn't work. Plus, I have Life 360. Plus, I have all those other apps, and um, I just wonder if Google still sends out a message to whatever tower you're near. I don't know. I don't know how this works. Like, all I know is when I'm driving and I'm using towers, listening to my Spotify, listening to music. When I drive by a McDonald's, a Starbucks, or whatever on the interstate, it disables my signal if I'm there long enough. So, um, I don't know if that has anything to do with that, you know? So, I didn't turn off my phone. um, so I was wondering if the phone was off, would it still be registering with something? Even as you were driving, like let's say you're driving and the phone is off. Could you still be having something in that phone tracking you? I guess that's the big question.
It could be email getting updated or inbound or outbound data of some sort.
Understood. So in this case, the accused Koberger wouldn't have had to have been actively on his phone to ping. It could be something in the background. Is that correct?
It could be something in the background that is generating those pings. True.
I know you said direction and potential trajectory. And does the radius depend upon how far apart the towers are? So basically, could they spot me in my car within a 2-block radius, or is it a 2-mile radius?
So that's a great question. In the country, outside of cities, in rural areas, the cell phones transmit a much longer distance than they do inside of cities. So it depends where you are as far as how far a cell tower will transmit.
In Moscow.
Well, this is true because I've had this happen firsthand. I was on the road and I encountered a fire on the side of the road. This oil refinery thing was on fire. I called 911. Well, the 911 operator that I got was 30 miles away. And she had to transfer me to another person that was closer to my location. And I was like, how the hell did I end up getting somebody from that city, which is 30 miles away? So I guess it all has to do with the tower that you're connecting to and where your call is going. Like, I mean, I wonder if like some towers get overwhelmed with calls and text messages and all this stuff and they reroute your signal to another tower that's not working as hard. Wonder if that has anything to do with it. I don't know. Just thinking here.
Idaho, it's not in the country. It is in no way in a big city, but there's 2 colleges right nearby. Because I would imagine colleges would need more power.
So here's an interesting thing. I drove past the University of Arizona yesterday, and one of the things that I noticed is that there are a tremendous number of 5G towers around the university. In the country where the accused was driving, there's probably a lot fewer. What's the distance between those two locations? Somebody said 10 minutes.
10 miles.
About 10 miles. So in the country, you're going to find that cell phone towers can be miles apart and cover miles in both directions from a cell phone tower. They vary in direction based upon geography and where people are and how the cell phone carrier wants to cover the area.
This isn't specifically a technical question, so we can skip over it if you want, but
This is a thought I just had. So if your phone is off and somebody's texting you or somebody's calling you, of course your phone it's going to go right to voicemail because, if your phone is off, your voicemail is going to pick up. If your phone is off, the text message is probably going to get saved until you turn your phone back on, right? So is that a transmission to a tower because somebody is using this to send you a message or send you a phone call? Just a thought.
The accused is a criminology PhD student. Is it surprising to you that if what's alleged is true, that he had his phone on him the whole time? I mean, even I know that my phone will leave a footprint.
It is surprising to me that someone with that background would have their phone with them. Agree. I would think somebody who has some intelligence about criminal backgrounds and criminology would probably at that level at least know that it's a bad idea to have your cell phone with you when you commit a crime.
Yeah, it's just so incongruous. As a PhD candidate, Koberger was also a teacher's assistant at Pullman, Washington State University, and we spoke with one of his students, and she's not wrong. That's one of the things that gives her pause on the alleged guilt is it's 101 to not do that. How frequently do pings update? Is it a standard amount of time? Does it depend situationally?
Wow, it depends. Pings get updated differently based upon which one of those three items is going on. You're going to see every time there is a text message sent, you can see a connection to a tower. And every time a cell phone call is initiated, or the cell phone changes towers, or the call ends, one of those three things when it's a phone call, you'll see a different tower recorded by the cell phone carrier. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. As a real example here, a white sedan that the prosecution alleges is Koberger's. It was seen passing by the victim's residence at 3:29, that same white vehicle at 4:04, and at 4:20 is seen leaving the area at high speed.
So let me ask you guys a question. So I remember in the PCA, he discussed it being possibly on airplane mode or being turned off. There's two different things. So if it's on airplane mode, the phone is still on. Is it still pinging based on some of the apps, or did he wipe the whole thing clean and it had no apps on it at all? Or if it was turned off, just like what we're talking about, would it be able to transmit anything or receive any transmission from somewhere else? Like somebody texting you, somebody calling you, you getting a notification, anything like that. Would that only record once you turn the phone back on? Because even in airplane mode, some notifications override and are stored somewhere, I know, because the moment you go off airplane mode, man, your phone is just like overwhelmed with all these things. So, just food for thought. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
Can officials attempt to corroborate? We see the car and then go and check the tower to see if that lines up.
So are you asking me if the law enforcement at the time can go do that or look back in history?
Go back in history. As a layman, I would want to think, oh, can I corroborate that with cell tower information?
You can corroborate the location of the cell phone. If it was in the car, you would be able to say, okay, it's in the car and it's moving, or it's in the car and stationary. If the cell phone is on and communicating with the tower. Because in this case, we see that the cell phone is connected at his home at 2:42 a.m., right? And then at 2:47, so 5 minutes later, it's moving and then gets turned off. And then it gets turned back on 4:48 south of Moscow, Idaho on State Highway 95. In between that, if I understand the timeline and what's listed here, the cell phone is off. So it's not talking to the towers at all. Interestingly, the car is a Kia, right?
It's a Hyundai Elantra.
A Hyundai Elantra. Okay, same company. Hyundai and Kia are the same company. So I wonder if they took that car apart and looked for cell phone signals coming out of that, because a lot of cars nowadays have cell phones built into them and they're constantly communicating.
Without knowing the specifics of Koberger's car, was it common for cars to be emitting signals?
A lot of cars in.
See, I wondered this too, but a lot of people have challenged that thought process and told me there was no way that that car he has had anything like that in there. There was no black box. There was nothing like that. So, you have to take people at what they say. Otherwise, they get quite hostile with you. So, as far as I know, from the people that I've heard from, they've told me that there was no black box. There was nothing um, to be able to track that car or that year of the car.
That time frame, we're starting to have cell phones built into them. One of the things that happens in our world is that a lot of devices are following us around. And when those devices connect to things, they get recorded. One of the things that has happened in our world, and you'll notice this on Google Maps, you'll notice this in other things that are used to track us through space and time. Wi-Fi signals have been collected by Google as part of what they did when they were mapping our world. And so you will see when you are navigating your car and you turn on Google Maps, it will say, if you want to have a better navigation experience or something along those lines, turn on Wi-Fi. And the reason why it uses that is now it's seeing Wi-Fi connections that are from homes that it passes by or businesses that it passes by. And it adds that to the mix. Not only is GPS very accurate, but it adds the Wi-Fi signal to the mix to track the vehicle or the phone and display the map.
If a phone, quote, stops reporting to the network, does that mean for 100% that the phone was turned off, or could there be another explanation?
If a phone stops talking to the network, it could be a host of things. It could be a distance problem out in the forest somewhere.
Did that type of car have OnStar or anything like that? Any kind of crash notification thing that runs, that is able to send a signal out where the car is? Anything like that?
Under a rock or inside a cave or something like that. However, for the most part, a cell phone not communicating with a tower is generally evidence that the cell phone is turned off or in airplane mode.
Here is my last two questions that I have. And I took an Uber the other day and I was at the back of a grocery store. And my Uber driver called me and he said, I need you to come to the front of the store. That's where I'm going to be. So, and I opened my Uber and I could see myself walking just from the front to the back of one store. Okay, why do we have that level of specificity for an Uber, but not here?
So, a lot of apps, navigation apps, Uber, Lyft, use GPS data, which is a much more accurate signal to place you at a particular place. GPS is much more accurate than these cell phone pings, much more accurate.
Why is GPS much more accurate than cell phone ping?
Did he have an Android or did he have an iPhone? Did he have an Apple Watch? Did he have anything that could connect him to any type of signal whatsoever?
Cell phone pings will give you an area, this pie-shaped area where the cell phone is located. GPS data can narrow that down to within feet. So a cell phone sector is what they're technically called, a pie-shaped area, could be many square miles. A GPS location is going to generally be within feet.
And I guess it is that GPS is that specific because that's its intention. Whereas cell phone towers are intended to allow our phones
to communicate.
Right, but not to track us.
So cell phone towers, and they're broken up into sectors so that the number of connections can be managed. GPS data is more specific so that you can navigate. You can be in a particular place and say, I want to go to this other place, and it's going to navigate you generally within feet.
Looking forward to trial. So the defense and prosecution, to our knowledge, they have to the public knowledge, there is the same data exists. How are two different experts going to read the same information and from there draw different conclusions?
Okay, so a little piece of this that you can look at. One is ZX and the other is Cellhawk. Those are two different products that both map where a cell phone is. As far as this guy, who's their cell phone expert?
Cy Ray is the founder of ZX Corporation.
Yeah. And he's the guy that's going to testify, we think?
Yes, the defense has said he will testify to corroborate Koberger's alibi and say that he was not at the residence because he was too far south.
We have 2 hours roughly between the cell phone being connected in his home and the cell phone being connected south of Moscow, Idaho. It's difficult for an expert to say that the phone wasn't somewhere if it was off. So we have two data points that are 2 hours apart. It's difficult for any expert in either direction, prosecution or defense, to prove or disprove where that cell phone is in those 2 hours. How are you going to prove that? You can't prove a negative. You can't. So
Okay, so this is what's going to go on in the trial. If they do have experts, like I heard somebody say the other day, a retired FBI person I was talking to, he told me, he said, you're going to have two sets of experts. You're going to have one that's for the defense, one that's for the prosecution. So what this guy is basically doing is saying there's no way that Cy Ray knows what he's talking about. And Cy Ray will probably say, well, there's no way that this guy knows what he's talking about. So you basically tried to disprove each other's theories, and whoever had the best presentation is going to win the trial. All the evidence and everything that people are focusing on and everything else is relevant to an extent, but it's who presents the best argument for the outcome. Can the prosecution present a better evidence or a better presentation on this is why Brian did it versus the defense saying this is why Brian couldn't have done it? So whoever the jury believes, that's who is going to get the guilty or not guilty verdict. And that, when it's all said and done, that's what it's all about. Because all the evidence and everything that we're trying to dig into and debunk and all this other stuff, however these lawyers put together a storyline that's either believable or not believable with those 12 jurors up there, that's going to determine the outcome. That's why it's so important for them to want to get it moved. One side wants it moved, one side wants it where it's at, because it's all about leverage. So everything that we're talking about is good. I enjoy talking about it, but it's not going to do anything in a trial if you have jurors that don't understand this stuff. I've listened to this guy about 10, 15 minutes, and I still am not clear on what he's said. Even though I kind of understand it, it's still kind of out there for me.
they could say, yeah, it's possible that between 2:47 and 4:48 in the morning that he made it over to this home and murdered people, but that's a lot of time in between. A lot of time. I don't see the defense and prosecution being very far apart in their testimony because they are looking at the same data. And the lack of data between 2:47 and 4:48 is just a lack of data. It's going to be difficult for either side to prove anything in that time frame.
It's so obvious what you said, and I don't know how it hadn't occurred. Of course, there's a dearth. There is no information.
Dearth is a perfect word to use. There's nothing. There's nothing. So the timeline shows that there is no data from the cell phone carrier between 2:47 and 4:48 in the morning.
How do you think the cell phone evidence will be received by a jury, or how do you feel cell phone evidence in general is received by juries?
As a person who presents cell phone evidence all the time, younger juries are very receptive to cell phone evidence. They use their phones all the time. They know that they're a computer they carry around in their pocket or on their hip or in their purse. There certainly can be older members of the jury that have a harder time understanding that. Sometimes I run into older judges that have a hard time understanding what that really means.
Let's stop here for another break. We'll be back.
That was a good statement right there, I believe, because that's going to kind of determine what kind of jurors you want. Do you want the younger jurors, or do you want the older generation that really has no clue how to use a cell phone? I mean, to be honest, there's a lot of older Americans that don't know what to do on this cell phone other than answer it. And some of the times they have a tough time doing that. You know? But the question I have a lot of questions. One of the questions that I have is, in that 2 hour span, if he turned off his phone when he was in Pullman and didn't turn it on for 2 hours later, or was in airplane mode, or whatever people say, because I don't want to argue with people. You're free to believe what you want to believe, just like I'm free to believe what I want to believe. What would make this individual, whoever, whether it was Brian or whether, whoever had this phone, what would make them turn it off or put it in airplane mode and then 2 hours later turn it back on? Have you ever turned your phone off for 2 hours? Have you ever turned it off while charging it? Had your phone ever gone dead and you realized it? Or what are some reasons this phone would be turned off? Not the fact that, see, I don't like that statement in the PCA where he went on that whole tangent about this is what criminals do, and more likely than not, they turn off their phones before they go commit a crime, because, in reality, not all criminals turn off their phones. Most of them are caught that way. Most of them forget to turn it off, you know. So I'm wondering, what was the purpose of this phone being turned off? If it wasn't off, what made the individual put it in airplane mode? And that is just a question that I hope I get an answer for at the trial, because that'd be nice to know. Even if it had nothing to do with innocence or guilt, I want to know the answer to that. What would have caused that individual, Brian, because he's in jail for this, to turn his phone off? Did he make any calls before he left his house? Did he text anybody? Did he make any calls after he turned it on? Did he text anybody after he turned it on? These type of things are important, and you would believe that the police or whoever investigated this would have those answers. And those are some of the answers that I hope to get one day, because it would be nice to know. It would be nice to know. Because I never turn my phone off unless I'm on a plane, or unless I might turn it down. I might turn the ringer down, but I don't really turn my phone off ever. Even in church, I just silence it. I don't ever turn it off. So turning it off would mean intent. You intentionally turned it off, or you intentionally put it in airplane mode. This was not an accident. And people have said, well, maybe the battery was dead. Well, I would believe that the investigators would be able to know whether the battery was dead or whether it was intentionally turned off. Like I said, I hope to learn that answer one day.
In a moment.
Life is happening around us. So many things to do, places to go.
Can do is get behind the wheel of an all-electric BMW.
What's your why for more information? That
crime scene to tying it to a potential murder suspect and how that ultimately is presented during trial.
In some murder cases, the motive is dead clear, no pun intended. He wanted her, she didn't want him, she rejected him, we get that. Two drug dealers go at each other over turf, one kills the other, we get that. These are harder cases because here's a dude who lives in a different state. He had no prior relationship that we know of with any one of these people. The government doesn't have to prove motive, but everyone in the courtroom is sitting there. And I can tell you, I've been there. Why did he do this? And I want to state to you right here and now, I don't have to prove motive. Motive is not an element of any of these crimes. And so when my colleague stands up on the defense and suggests what's the motive, that's an interesting question, but we're not here to resolve that. We're here to resolve whether he committed this crime and whether I've proven beyond a reasonable doubt each and every element of the offense to which he's been charged. This isn't a whodunit. And I don't have to prove to you why he done it.
That's so interesting because you hear in so many cases motive, 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 but that's not.
It's never an element. It's never an element. It's the smoke cloud that's drifting around the courtroom in every case like this. It's just hanging in the air. And every time I was a defense.
And like this individual just said, to prove the elements of the crime, that means he's been charged with 4 counts of murder. That means 4 times he's going to have, not individually, but he could be proven guilty on 1 count of those murders and be not guilty on the other 3. And you laugh at that, but stranger things have happened. He could be proven guilty on the burglary. Just interesting.
Counsel, it was motive, motive, motive. They haven't proved motive. I don't know why they haven't proved motive. That's because clearly there wasn't a motive. And I'm playing the other game. You haven't heard 1 ounce of evidence against my client about why he would do something. Why would a upstanding PhD candidate who has everything in front of him do something like this? It's absurd. And that's the kind of argument you're going to hear.
But it's not material.
It's not an element of the offense. Murders are driven by love, lust, power, or money. Those are the big 4. And then since I'm a Shakespearean, I would add greed, because greed is one of them as well. I watched the proceedings in this for just a few minutes today in preparation to chat.
Okay, so if they're committed by those 4 reasons, you would have to ask yourself, can you plug those 4 reasons into anybody that you've heard about around these victims? Can you?
With you, and it seemed like the prosecutor's sort of a no-nonsense older fella who's just doing his job, and it seems like this public defender is, doing what she can with a really tough case. And clearly, at this point, Kohlberger still wants his trial. I wouldn't be surprised if he changes his mind. I would not be surprised if he changes his mind, because I would suspect behind the scenes, this public defender is going to the prosecutor and going, okay, what can we do here? My guy's willing to do this, plead to this if you're willing to cap confinement at this. He wants to be able to see, sunshine before he's dead. And if I was the government, depending on the strength of the evidence, and I don't know the evidence, nor do you, we only know what we've read, I might say, yeah, I'm willing to discuss, in theory, a plea. Of course, the families are going to have a say in that, depending on what the state victim rights statute says. There's a lot of green between the ball and the cup here. Oftentimes you take your best shot during pretrial motions when you're the defense counsel, and depending on how they turn out, then you can go back to your client and go, look, we're 0 for 5. It's looking real bad for you. More than happy to defend you. I'm a fighter. I don't know what the state law allows for. But in the federal system and in some states, you get a break on sentencing if you plead guilty. And the opposite is true. If you go to trial, the judge, one of the factors is that you not getting punished for going to trial, but you don't get a break for pleading guilty.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. They can't increase the punishment because you exercised your right to have a trial. But if you plead guilty, they can give you a break for pleading guilty and not expending court time.
Right, because I mean, this case, if what I read just the other day is accurate, it's already up over $3 million.
Which is a drop in the bucket for a big jurisdiction. But for a little tiny jurisdiction like where they are, they have never seen a case like this in the history of that county. And so for a little county like this, that doesn't have a lot of crime, to have a big case like this with cell site location information and DNA and all the rest of it with national attention, they're going to go through some money. But, justice shouldn't have a cost to it. The thing about murder cases is somebody did it. Somebody did it. And justice requires accountability in a murder case. And it's the ultimate case because in a situation like this, where they were perfectly innocent, helpless, young people with their whole lives in front of them, but for victims who are children and babies, these are the most sympathetic types of victims. And so there is no reason for the government to give the defendant an inch if they have a solid case.
I mean, people have been collecting DNA for a long time. So it would seem like unless you're really messing up on the collection, then if your DNA is on the sheath, guess what? You're probably there. How does the defense counter this?
There can be other innocent explanations for the presence of a person's DNA at a crime scene other than the fact that they're the perp. And so you could, I have asked myself, and I have seen in my courtrooms when I was a judge or a prosecutor, defense counsel saying, well, okay, you're saying that the defendant's DNA was found in this barracks room in the Navy. Yes, it was. And isn't it the fact that these study groups study in their rooms? Yes, it is. So you can't disprove that my client, the defendant, wasn't in the victim's room as part of a study group, can you? Well, no, I can't, not from a forensic standpoint. So you're trying to create reasonable doubt, which is your job as a defense counsel. And there are oftentimes innocent explanations for the presence of someone's DNA at a crime scene. Now, are there innocent explanations for the DNA of Brian Kohlberger found on the knife sheath, on the bloody bed sheets of an apartment in a different state? I have a very, very, very hard time wrapping my head around how you create reasonable doubt to explain the presence of his DNA at a murder scene in a different state in a kid's apartment. So that's a big hurdle for this defense counsel. And of course, so instead of attacking.
Logically, how could that be explained? If you don't go with the police planted that, or possibly, I've heard all kinds of doozies. Possibly that somebody gave Maddie the sheath and the knife, and she had it under her pillow, and she was fighting to kill her off, and that's how the killer got the DNA on it. I've heard all kinds of stuff. So how could you logically, without going down rabbit holes and everything else, how could you logically put that there? How could that be there? It's not an actual match. Okay. I've heard you ask people in your chat as well, how do you know that? Can you type that in the chat? I know I've heard a lot of things about that sheath. And I've been listening to people's theories for a long time now, and you have to ask yourself logically with your own mind, how can that have happened? Okay, then if it wasn't an actual match, then how many other people's DNA was with that DNA sample? Like, if it wasn't just his there, who else was there with it? There was three. There was three that they found. And I'm not talking about the three that they found, the one with the cigarette and then the other two by the victim. I'm talking about three that they found on the knife sheath. So to explain all that, logically, you have to ask yourself certain questions. Get the answers in a way that makes sense to you. And I know that a lot of you have those answers for yourself, and that's a good thing.
That they're going after the cell site location information. And they're putting up an alibi defense. If you have an alibi defense, you're required to notify the government of your alibi within a certain period of time before the trial, and then give specifics of what your alibi is, because the government can then try to go poke holes and find out if there's any holes in your alibi defense. And we'll see how the defense plays out, but it seems as if they've created enough wiggle room in this loosey-goosey alibi defense that puts him driving around at random places at random times in the middle of the night in the general location of the crime. But of course, I'm sure their cell site location person is going to say, well, he wasn't exactly at the place. But the problem is this guy had been to the crime scene multiple times, according to the cell site location information. And in all the other times he was there, he didn't turn his cell phone off. And yet, just coincidentally, on the night of the murder, his cell phone turns off for a period of when the murders were said to have happened, and then it turns back on as he's heading back to his college. It just doesn't look good for him. Oftentimes, in a case where you have the defendant's DNA at the scene of a crime where there's no prior relationship.
What's going to be sad about this case is if they don't get it moved, and all this stuff that people believe, how they've been pushing this stuff about the cell phone was turned off, the cell phone was turned on, the DNA and the knife sheaths, all this stuff. And people really don't understand the logistics of it, or they haven't been following this case like a lot of people. They're only going to go on the narrative that they hear in those 6 weeks of trial. They're not going to have 2.5 years, almost 3 years worth of time to have been dissecting this to see if this man is innocent or guilty. And that's going to be the hard part about this whole case, is they're only going to have 6 weeks. They're going to have 6 weeks to decide the innocence or the guilt of this individual, based on what the prosecution presents, what the defense presents. They're not even going to go back and listen to the preliminary. They're not going to go back and hear all the motions to compel hearings. They're not going to hear all that. They're not going to go through the suppression hearing. They're not going to hear all that. They're just going to hear the trial. So in 6 weeks, they're going to hear what these two sides have to present. They're not going to, once it gets to that point, it's going to be very crunch time for these individuals, the defense and the prosecution. So if this man really didn't do it, he better hope his defense team has a hell of a game plan. And if he did do it, the prosecution better have a hell of a game plan. Because one way or the other, it's getting down to the end, and it's going to get solved one way or the other. So I like discussing this case like we're doing it. I like that we can disagree and agree and everything else under the sun. But the reality is, once those jurors get picked, and what they're sequestered and everything else, and the trial starts, all this isn't going to make a hill of beans for him. None of this. And it's going to be sad if this individual is innocent and they find him guilty, based on the ability to paint a bigger picture of how he could have done it versus how he didn't do it. So I hope that you hear that, because, there's a lot of questions that people have about all the things that go on or went on during this case. And at no point is there going to be, like in the movie, somebody come in out of the blue at the last second. I got hidden evidence that's going to exonerate this man. Not going to happen like that. There's going to be a hell of a fight going on in that courtroom, just like there was on the second floor. And for the sake of those 4 kids, I hope they get it right. I hope they get it right because those 4 kids need closure. The families need closure, and everybody involved, their friends, everybody involved. You know. Let's listen to the rest of it.
Between the victim and the defendant, and they're complete strangers, and it's found in a very, very inconvenient place for the defendant, they end up pleading guilty. Because when you're the defense counsel and you get that information and you understand what it means, you finally have the come to Jesus talk with your client, say, game's up. You have a right to a trial. Of course, I'll defend you and I'll give you a great defense. Notice I didn't ask you whether you did it or not. So you can take the stand, say whatever you want. However, from my experience, there is no reasonable explanation of why your DNA is there, except for the fact that you did it. I don't think the government's going to have a hard time proving beyond a reasonable doubt that you did it. And most defendants, who are sitting in that situation, will be like, okay, and so they try to get the best deal they can.
I mean, it seems like they're going full bore.
The problem is that, of course, go on the record, this guy's presumed innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt by legal and competent evidence. He enjoys that presumption of innocence through the entire trial. That said, the evidence is overwhelming, as we've seen it to this date, for guilt. Because not only do you have the police stopping of the car and the cell site location information of him, what looks to be scouting out the crime scenes, but you have people who were alive, who he didn't kill, who said a person looked like this, and they picked him out. And then you have his DNA, and then you have the cell site location information on the night of, and you have him turning the cell phone off. Any two of those pieces of evidence alone would get you close to beyond a reasonable doubt. I think the DNA alone gets them to beyond a reasonable doubt. But when you have all the other circumstantial and direct evidence, I see this case as what's called a slow plea. A slow plea is he's just guilty. Everyone knows he's guilty, but he has a constitutional right to demand his trial, and he's going forward with the trial. And of course, he's presumed innocent. I'll say that again. But to me, this looks like a slow plea and a guy who's just not willing to accept responsibility for his actions. Maybe he'll be acquitted. I don't know. But it looks like a slow plea to me. And so this will be a battle of the experts on the cell site location information. That the government will say he went from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He turned it off between here, and that puts him at the house on or around the time of the murder. And the defense will come up and say, yeah, we can't dispute that he was there, but that could mean he was way over here in this bubble. If I was the government, I'd say, okay, all right, let's just pretend that everything the defense expert said is true, and let's just throw out the cell site location information. Here's all the other evidence that points out that he's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In fact, let's take 4 other pieces of evidence off. He's still guilty. Let's take 9 pieces of evidence off. He's still guilty. So I wouldn't play into that. I'd fight it hard, and then I would just talk about, is that reasonable? Because that's not reasonable.
More on that next time. For more information on the case and relevant photos, follow us on Instagram at KT_studios.
Okay, let me find that little bit that I was going to play last night on Howard Bloom and let you guys hear that. And then I'm going to call it a day. Let me turn on some music while I'm doing that. Okay, found it. Let's get on with this.
Or you can win at Modo. Register today at modo.us for your free welcome bonus.
Modo is a social casino. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited. Play responsibly. Conditions apply. See website for details.
Modo.us.
If you're a smoker looking for an alternative to traditional tobacco, you might feel uncertain at the thought of changing things up. Maybe your Zyn is a satisfying tobacco alternative that
experiencing thoughts of suicide, dial 988, then press 1 to reach the Veterans Crisis Line.
Stephanie and I continue our conversation with Pulitzer Prize-nominated author Howard Bloom, whose in-depth reporting prompted him to write the book When the Night Comes Falling, A Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders.
Not to put words in your mouth, but, all of our hearts are with the friends and families, obviously, of the beautiful victims. And obviously the town is kind of trying to heal, I would imagine. Was there any takeaway just from being there and sort of being in that beehive during this critical time?
Yes, I think healing is impossible for the town until there is a trial, until there is a verdict. And I think the town will always be suspicious. I think you can knock down, bulldoze all the, that murder houses that you want, and yet the demons will still be unleashed. And yet there also is a history of savagery in that town. I mean, I found a book that was written in 1945 by a woman by Carol Ryan, whose grandfather was a town doctor. And he was just shot in cold blood. And she writes about the savage forces that are at bay in this town. It's still a wild Western place. Every police officer now has an emblem, a shoulder patch on his police uniform, and it shows the clock tower in town. The clock tower is set for 1:49, I think it is, and that was the hour of the day where Lee Newbill, who was a police officer there, was shot and killed by a deranged gunman who also killed a church deacon. There's been very many unexplained outbursts of violence in the town. There's a task force that's been looking into child pornography in the town. There's large drug use. It's a pretty place, but it's a deceptive place. And it's a town almost on the verge, as one of the lawyers in town told me, of a civil war. Because on one side, you have this right-wing church group that wants to create what they calls a theocracy, where Moscow is the capital of the American redoubt. This redoubt is a conservative nation. And on the other side, you have one of the most liberal universities in the state, a party school, the first-ranked party school in all of Idaho. So these two cultures, these two values clash, and you can see it when you walk down Main Street. On one side of Main Street are the old businesses that are owned by the Christchurch Kirkers. On the other side are the freewheeling bars and places where kids hang out. And there's also a really good Italian restaurant opposite the Kirker Church. It's really good.
Dichotomous nature really does come to life. I have a specific question. You mentioned that Kaylee's father was going through Kaylee's phone in an effort to understandably get to the bottom of what happened with his daughter. Why didn't authorities have her phone?
Well, Kaylee's father is an interesting character in this whole story. I never interviewed him, but I spoke to a lot of people who spoke with him. He's made lots of public statements. And to my mind, he's in many ways a hero. I mean, he's someone who refuses to let his daughter's death become a cold case. He refuses to accept things at face value, and he wants to get to the bottom of things. And there's something very valiant, very heroic. He's like a figure from Shakespeare who just wants to keep on going and find out what's happening. At the same time, while he's doing this, he's also in many ways destroying his ability to get over these events. He's caught up in it. He's now, I think, angry at my book. I'm not quite sure why. Actually, it breaks my heart. The last person I would want to do is insult him. How can you impugn any action taken by a man who lost his daughter, the father of three? My heart goes out to him. A man who has to say to reporters, You send your girl off to college and she comes back to you in an urn. That kind of statement is heartbreaking. And a man who stares into the camera when he's being interviewed and says to the killer who's out there, I am coming for you. He's making a promise to the killer and a promise to himself. So in that way, I think he's a hero, and his actions are heroic. And I'm just sorry he's not happy about the way he's portrayed. I tried to, I think, do it respectfully and with dignity, but I treated his daughter with dignity too. And that was, if I didn't, certainly apologize for that, because these kids were just wonderful young people, and to not have the chance to live out their lives and to be what they were going to be is just unfair. The heavens were just not fair to them.
I've seen so much footage of Mr. Gonzalez, and I think I speak on behalf of anyone who's been following this case. We are rallying for every parent and every family member to get justice. And it's true, when he does speak into the camera, you feel it like a dagger in your own heart. So yeah, collectively, I think we can all agree that for every parent who's gone through a nightmare like this, and then to them specifically, there's no words really.
I appreciate your giving the time, and I hope people will read the book on two levels. One, as this suspense story that's a police drama, and then secondly, as a character study of, in some ways, two fathers who become victims of this whole drama, of Michael Koberger, Steve Goncalves. Both of them get caught up in events that are just unimaginable, larger than lives, and are impossible to deal with, and yet they have to deal with the impossible. There's a tension in this entire book, and even as I go around talking about it, talking about things that don't make sense and yet happened.
More on that next time.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you for your input. Thank you for your comments. And I hope everybody enjoyed it. Hit the like button or dislike button on your way out, whichever one you choose. And I hope to see y'all again soon. Y'all have a wonderful weekend. Maestro, cue that music.